Every time you start a new job, apply for a credit card, or file your taxes, you are required to provide a specific 9-digit number. It feels like a fundamental, inescapable law of modern American life. Yet the United States had no universal Social Security numbers until 1936. When exactly did the federal government decide it needed to track every working citizen by a unique numerical identifier? And how did they convince a fiercely independent population to accept it? This is not just a story about bureaucratic record-keeping or administrative convenience. It is a story about the fundamental architecture of state power, the sheer logistical terror of managing the Great Depression, and a permanent shift in how a government sees its people. Before the 1930s, the federal government barely knew who you were. You might interact with the local post office, or perhaps the military if there was a draft. But for the vast majority of citizens, federal identification simply did not exist. There were no national databases, no centralized employment records, and no standardized way for Washington to track your lifetime earnings. So how did you prove who you were? You relied almost entirely on local networks and physical documents. You used a family Bible with handwritten birth records, a baptismal certificate from your local parish, or simply the sworn word of a community member who knew your face. The very idea of a centralized registry containing the names and locations of all working Americans was widely viewed with intense suspicion. It was often dismissed as a hallmark of European authoritarianism, an overreach of state surveillance that was considered deeply un-American. The federal government was small, distant, and largely irrelevant to the daily economic survival of the average family. Then came the catastrophic economic collapse of 1929. The Great Depression shattered the long-held illusion that local charities, extended families, and state governments could manage poverty and old age destitution on their own. By the early 1930s, millions of elderly Americans were facing literal starvation after their life savings evaporated in bank failures. The political pressure for a national safety net became impossible to ignore, forcing the Roosevelt administration to design a system of social insurance on a scale never before attempted in the Western Hemisphere. But a national pension created a problem no one had solved before. To pay it out fairly, the government needed a precise way to track the lifetime earnings of every single industrial and commercial worker in the country. You cannot calculate a fair retirement benefit based on a percentage of wages if you have absolutely no idea what those wages actually were over a span of 30 years. And the logistical hurdle was staggering. The United States had no central database, no national computer networks, and no standard way to distinguish between the tens of thousands of men named John Smith scattered across the continent. Early planners realized that tracking workers by name alone would result in an administrative disaster of lost records and misdirected funds. They needed an anchor, an absolute, immutable identifier that would stay with a person from their first paycheck until the day they died. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act into law on August 14, 1935, the legislation itself contained a glaring omission. The text of the law did not explicitly mandate a specific 9-digit numbering system, nor did it dictate exactly how the government should track these individual lifetime earnings. The newly formed Social Security Board was simply handed a legislative mandate and an impossible deadline. Payroll tax collections were legally scheduled to begin on January 1, 1937. The board had barely 12 months to invent a viable tracking system from scratch, print the materials, and convince roughly 26 million American workers to voluntarily register themselves with the federal government. To lead this monumental task, the board turned to a massive, existing federal apparatus that already had a presence in every single American town: the United States Postal Service. In the autumn of 1936, post offices across the country were transformed into makeshift registration hubs. Letter carriers distributed millions of application forms, known as Form SS5, directly to workplaces and homes. But before a single card could be issued, the board had to finalize the architecture of the identifier itself. They needed a number long enough to accommodate future generations, but structured logically enough to be sorted by human clerks and early IBM punch card machines. Here is how that number actually worked. The resulting 9-digit sequence was not random. It was a geographic and administrative map. The first 3 digits represented the area number, assigned based on the geographic region where the card was issued, starting in the Northeast and moving westward. The middle 2 digits were the group number, designed strictly to break the numbers into manageable blocks for the clerks handling the paper files. The final 4 digits were the serial number, a straight numerical sequence assigned to the individual within that specific group. This mechanical structure allowed file clerks in a centralized Baltimore facility to manually route and store millions of paper records with remarkable efficiency. But the introduction of this numbering system triggered a wave of deep public anxiety. The debate over how to physically track citizens had been intense from the beginning. Some administration officials had advocated for a mandatory fingerprinting system, arguing it was the only foolproof way to prevent fraud. This idea was met with fierce public backlash. Fingerprinting was heavily associated with the criminal justice system and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Working-class Americans were terrified that a national fingerprint registry would be used to track union organizers, suppress labor strikes, and build a police state. To avoid a political catastrophe, the board abandoned fingerprinting and settled on the numerical code. But as the January 1937 deadline for tax collection loomed, a new wave of opposition erupted. Conservative newspaper moguls, most notably William Randolph Hearst, launched a massive propaganda campaign against the numbering system. Editorials warned that the Roosevelt administration was planning to force every American laborer to wear a stainless steel dog tag stamped with their federal number. They published grim political cartoons depicting workers marching in chain gangs, reduced to mere digits by a tyrannical bureaucracy. The panic over the rumored metal tags grew so intense that the Roosevelt administration was forced to aggressively counterattack. The government flooded movie theaters with instructional newsreels, explicitly promising the public that the Social Security number was strictly an accounting tool. Administration officials swore up and down that the number would remain completely confidential. It was heavily emphasized that the flimsy paper card was not a national identity document, and it would never be used by the police or other federal agencies to track citizens. The public accepted this compromise, trading a small slice of anonymity for the promise of financial security in their old age. Yet that sacred promise of isolation would not survive the decade. Why not? The architecture of the system was simply too useful for the rest of the federal government to ignore. As the United States mobilized for World War II, the sheer logistical demands of tracking millions of drafted soldiers, managing rationing boards, and identifying defense contractors overwhelmed the fragmented record-keeping of other agencies. The definitive fracture in the barrier between the Social Security Administration and the rest of the government occurred in 1943. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9397, a sweeping directive that quietly revolutionized American identity. The order mandated that any federal agency establishing a new system for tracking individuals must use the Social Security number as its primary identifier. The logic was purely administrative. It made no sense for the military, the civil service, and the tax authorities to each invent their own parallel numbering systems. With the stroke of a pen, the protective wall around the 9-digit code was demolished. The identifier that was strictly promised to be nothing more than a retirement accounting tool was now the master key for the entire federal apparatus. The era of the Universal American Identification Number had officially begun, setting the stage for a dramatic post-war expansion that would permanently link a citizen's personal identity to their financial survival. The dam finally broke in 1961. The Internal Revenue Service, drowning in a sea of paper tax returns and struggling to track the expanding post-war middle class, realized they needed a centralized numerical anchor. Congress authorized the IRS to adopt the Social Security number as the official taxpayer identification number. This was the mechanical climax of the federal tracking system. The process of tax collection was being digitized, shifting from human clerks reading paper files to massive mainframe computers reading magnetic tape. When the IRS adopted the 9-digit code, it required a mechanical link between your employer's payroll systems, your bank's interest reports, and your personal tax return. By matching the Social Security number across these different magnetic tapes, federal computers could automatically cross-reference your stated income against what your employer reported, instantly flagging discrepancies. Once the IRS proved the sheer efficiency of this cross-referencing mechanism, the private sector quickly followed suit. Banks, hospitals, and utility companies realized that the federal government had already done the heavy lifting of assigning a unique identifier to nearly every adult in the country. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the American financial system underwent a massive consolidation. Localized lending shifted to national credit networks. While localized credit bureaus had long used their own proprietary rating systems, the standardized credit score we know today wasn't introduced until 1989. To make that universal algorithmic system work across thousands of different lenders, the credit bureaus needed a single, standardized anchor to tie your mortgage history, credit card debt, and auto loans together. They adopted the Social Security number. And here is the twist at the heart of the entire system. The 9-digit code was never designed to be a secure password. It has no biometric link, no cryptographic security, and no physical failsafe. Yet because it became the master key for both the IRS and the private banking sector, it evolved into an accidental national identity card. The government actively fought this perception for decades. From 1946 until 2011, the Social Security Administration literally printed the words, "Not for identification," on the bottom of the cards. But the sheer convenience of a universal number defeated the original promises of privacy. The winners of this structural shift were the massive administrative bureaucracies and national financial institutions, which could now process millions of transactions with frictionless efficiency. The losers were the everyday citizens, whose entire financial identity was now tied to a static string of 9 numbers, leaving them deeply vulnerable to modern identity theft. Today, we are trapped in the architecture of a 1936 stopgap measure, a system engineered by clerks with punch cards to prevent elderly starvation has become the mandatory gateway to modern economic participation. So consider where you stand. Does the administrative convenience of a universal tracking number justify the permanent loss of financial anonymity? Or was the public of 1936 right to fear the inevitable creep of government data collection? The systems that govern our daily lives rarely happen by accident. They are built through crisis, compromise, and the quiet expansion of administrative power. If you want to understand the hidden origins of the institutions you interact with every day, subscribe to our channel as we continue to investigate the unseen architecture of the modern world.